All right, you guys good? All right, so we left off with the Populist Party movement. So the Populist Party is going to come about during the Gilded Age. It's mainly a group that forms toward the end of the 1800s. Group of disgruntled farmers from the Midwest. They refer to themselves as the Grangers. They're going to start to unite with a really powerful labor party movement that occurred during this era. They're called the Knights of Labor. They were one of the largest and most powerful labor unions in the post-Civil War era. I'll talk more about them when we get into lesson 12 with the Progressive Era. That was a labor union made up of skilled and unskilled workers. Obviously, we've already talked a little bit about the battle over currency. There are people that wanted monometallism or a gold standard. There are also people that wanted the minting of silver. They were known as the Silverite Coalition. And then there's the Greenback Party that wanted inflationary tactics of printing more cash. Ultimately, those two groups, the Silverite Coalition that were made up of some moderate Democrats and the Greenback Party, not to be confused with the more modern Green Party, the Greenback Party, they start to get absorbed into this group. It's kind of like what we saw happen with all those splinter groups prior to the Civil War, getting under the umbrella of the Republican Party. A lot of these splinter groups at the turn of the century end up getting under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. So the main call for the populists, they want labor rights, they want limits on big business, they really want to take down monopolies, and they are also in favor of the free coinage of silver by metalism. You have to understand in the post-Civil War era, there's massive silver booms that will occur in places like Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. Have you guys ever heard of Park City, Utah? It's a very famous place to go skiing and snowboarding nowadays outside of Salt Lake. Well, before it was ever a resort community, had a silver mining boom. So what the Silverite Coalition motto was, 16 to 1. 16 ounces of silver to every ounce of gold. Now, during the presidency of Grant, all the way up to the turn of the century, there were periods throughout in which silver was minted and helped back the dollar, but conservatives are, especially the tycoons, are far more apt to support monometallism or a gold standard because they control the majority of the wealth as well as the reserves of gold. So there are other items on the populist agenda. They promoted a graduated income tax. This was actually challenged in a pretty famous court case, Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust at the end of the 1800s. What this will ultimately evolve into is the passage in the early 1900s of the 16th Amendment, which guarantees the federal government has the ability to levy a graduated income tax. What do I mean by graduated income tax? What does that mean? Yeah. You pay taxes based off what you make. Things are a little bit different now. We still have a graduated income tax. How many of you guys are about to file for taxes, your tax returns, right? So you got your W-2s? You just did it? Okay. Well, you all pay what is called a payroll income tax. Hey, what a return. I'll go spend it all out in one place. So We have kind of a blend of that nowadays. We all are tied to a payroll income tax if we have jobs, but we are also still tied to a graduated income tax depending on how much we make. That's the level in which we're taxed. Government regulation of railroads and telegraphs and telephones. We're going to talk more about telephones in our next lesson. Direct elections of U.S. senators, which will lead to the passage of the 17th Amendment. We're going to learn about that in lesson 12, the Progressive Era. Political office term limits, notably in Congress. There are still people today that have proposed term limits. The initiative in the referendum, which I'm going to teach you about more in depth in lesson 12. A shorter workday, like how many hours a day are they proposing that we work? Bless you. 8-hour workdays. Very good. Immigrant restriction. Why might laborers in this era be pushing for immigration restriction? What are they fearful that they'll lose? Their jobs. So there's a lot going on here with their agenda. One remarkable and impressive piece of this story is that in the late 1800s, there is some sort of quasi partnership between white and African American farmers, because a lot of white and African American farmers that took advantage of the Homestead Act and went west, they've got the same problems, regardless of race. It comes down to the economic issue. Sadly, though, as we already know, what laws make their way west and north that tear apart those partnerships? Jim Crow. Women are going to have a voice in the Populist Party. One very famous populist organizer was Mary Elizabeth Lease. She famously remarked in a speech to populists, what you farmers need to do is raise less corn and more help. One really important person, at least politician from this era, is an Ohio politician by the name of Jacob Coxey, who is going to lead what is called Coxey's Army. It's a group of unemployed laborers. It's the first major labor rights march on Washington in 1894. It was in response to the Panic of 1893. What Coxey and his followers are pushing the government to do is to develop more federal jobs to help the unemployed gain work, mainly by building new roads and bridges and other internal improvements. The most famous populist of all, though, is William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was born in Illinois, became a lawyer, lives most of his life in Nebraska, is elected to Congress from the 1st District of Nebraska, and he becomes sort of like the face of the Populist Party. However, the Populists are kind of like a splinter sort of group at this time, and the Democratic Party kind of pops the umbrella up and brings the Populists under it at the turn of the century, and William Jennings Bryan is going to end up getting the Democratic nomination for president in the election of 1896 at the age of 36. This is very young to get a presidential nomination. And he is going to give a very famous speech, the Cross of Gold speech, where he basically says that mankind should not be crucified on a cross of gold. He is in support of bimetallism. A very important moment for everyone in here is for you to understand that this is when the Democratic Party starts to move toward an agenda, not the entirety of the party, but a good portion of the Democratic Party starts to move into a pro-labor agenda, whereas the Republican Party starts to shift its platform toward pro-business. Does that make sense? So a lot of times students will say, when's that period where we start to see the change in the party platform? It's right here at the turn of the 20th century. During the Gilded Age is where we start to see that shift. Do you guys have any questions up to this point? We're not done with William Jennings Bryan. He's going to stay with us for a few more lessons. All right. So top left is a Granger cartoon. This is a very powerful cartoon from the time. It shows a farmer pointing at the railroad, and the railroad cars say consolidation, bribery. Trying to see what that one says. Get a closer look over here. Extortion. And the train is just driving over the people, and they're not really paying attention. The farmers and the railroads have a very contentious relationship because why do the farmers have to depend on the railroad? Bless you. Why do the farmers have such a large dependency on the railroad? Yeah. Yes, they have to get their goods to market, right? And in the Midwest, these marketplaces, to be able to really sell your goods, are on the East and the West Coast, right? Also, something that we have to think about is these farmers are competing against farmers globally, right? Farming is happening large scale in South America. It's happening on a large scale in Australia. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in Asia. They're trying to compete. What are some of the major crops coming out of the Midwest that are global trade items then and still today? Huh? That's more of a southern crop. Wheat. What crop comes to mind when I mention Nebraska? Corn. Okay? Wheat and corn become big business. Bottom left, if you see a little guy in a top hat and tails, sometimes he's even creepier than this. Sometimes he's a pantsless baby with top hat and tails. It's very strange. And he's got like a golden scepter. He is the symbol for free silver or bimetallism. So what he's showing you in this image from the Grant administration is what bimetallism looked like with the minting of silver in 1872, and then what monometallism looked like later. Because the minting of silver, that whole process really got started in the Grant administration. It had happened before, but those silver booms in the post-Civil War era allowed for the minting of silver. This is a very, very famous cartoon in the top right. That's William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold cartoon related to the Cross of Gold speech. In the bottom right here, this is Jacob Coxey's Labor March on Washington. Any questions up to this point? Okay, so the Western frontier. The West, still largely untamed after the Civil War ends. Native Americans, Mexican immigrants, or mestizos, which were natural-born Mexican-American citizens in the Southwest, also Tejanos, Mormons in Utah, a blend of all types of groups in California, Chinese, Irish, Civil War vets, and lots of wildlife mainly inhabited the West. And there are numerous Native American tribes in the region. Native Americans are stuck in a very tough spot because they're trying to hold on to their traditions, they're trying to hold on to their language, and they're trying to hold on to their land. But in the post-war era, there's this huge wave of settlement that goes out west, due in part to the expansion of the railroad and the Homestead Act. There are numerous pull factors that take people out west. Would-be farmers, would-be miners, would-be railroad construction workers, entrepreneurs, cowboys. There's lots of opportunity in the West. Another issue that complicates things is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was established as a result of the Indian Removal Act, but the whole goal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was to negotiate with tribes as well as to provide aid. The problem, though, is that very little aid that America promised to provide actually wound up in the hands of any of the tribes. Most of that money was stolen through embezzlement. Diseases are killing Native Americans at a high rate. Dysentery, yellow fever. Are y'all familiar with tuberculosis? Tuberculosis is a big-time killer in the post-Civil War era. Migrant hunters, notably Civil War vets, are going to come out west to hunt buffalo to near extinction. Also, there are going to be, high prices for buffalo hides and buffalo meat and all these other parts of the buffalo in the east, notably buffalo hides. Relations between the natives and the federal government was constantly strained. As I previously mentioned, if we were to list all of the treaties that were negotiated with tribes in the West, many of which were negotiated at Fort Laramie in Wyoming, all of those treaties were ultimately broken by the federal government. The so-called Western Indian Wars, and what I mean by this is Native American wars between the government and natives west of Mississippi, pretty much occur from the end of the Civil War, not the very end, but close to it, 1864 to 1890. Starting with the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred in Colorado, which targeted the Cheyenne, which was a massacre that took place under a truce. And it ends with the Battle of Wounded Knee, which I'm sure everyone here has heard of before. Yeah, this is the end of the Western Indian Wars that was directed toward the Lakota Sioux. After the Civil War, the Army's mission: confine Native Americans to reservations, promote buffalo hunting, and support railroad production. By 1900, 5 transcontinental rail lines will be complete. About a fifth of the standing army in the West were made up of African American soldiers, often known as the Buffalo Soldiers. Why is this a very complex and tragic scenario for these African American soldiers? What have they just fought for? Their freedom. What are they fighting against now? Other people's freedoms. See, there's a really sort of ironic and very tragic story on the back end of the Civil War for a lot of our African American soldiers. The Battle of Little Bighorn is the absolute turning point of all this. Have you guys ever heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn? Okay, this occurred in what is now southern Montana. Are y'all familiar with an area called the Badlands and the Black Hills? Well, the Black Hills belong to the Sioux. Something is discovered in the Black Hills, though. Anyone want to take a guess? Gold. Gold is discovered in the Black Hills. So the government now wants the Sioux out of the Black Hills. They are going to send in a lieutenant colonel and a low-key hero for the Union from the Civil War, George Armstrong Custer. Prior to this engagement, Custer had a pretty substantial amount of military success, leading smaller forces against larger forces at the end of the Civil War. This is one in which it does not work out because he's outnumbered, he and his soldiers are outnumbered somewhere between 7 and 8 to 1 in this particular battle against the Sioux. And he and his detachment, nearly all of them will die in the Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand. However, what makes it a turning point isn't necessarily his death or the death of those American soldiers. What makes it a turning point is the government gets serious about Native American resistance, and the military presence in the West ramps up. Another famous chief in the West, Chief Geronimo, led the Apache resistance against about a quarter of the U.S. Army. Geronimo was held as a POW for 23 years. Now, the massacre that brings all of this to an end, or at least it's the beginning of the end, is on December 29th, 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee. The reason that the Lakota Sioux were attacked at Wounded Knee was because they were performing a forbidden ceremonial dance known as the ghost dance. Somewhere between 200 and 300 men, women, and children were murdered at Wounded Knee. Following the events of Wounded Knee, natives were either confined to reservations or they were dead due to disease or warfare. Again, a very tragic chapter. If you would like an interesting perspective about the plight of the Native Americans from this era, I highly recommend A Century of Dishonor by Helen Hunt Jackson. And it's an expose on American and Native American, U.S. and Native American relations from the end of the American Revolution to Wounded Knee. Highly recommend it. Top center, that's Fort Laramie in Wyoming. Top right, the Buffalo Hunters. There's some really significantly powerful guns that come about at the end of the Civil War that are going to allow the Buffalo Hunters to just totally annihilate these herds of bison. The Henry repeating rifle, as well as the Winchester repeating rifle. Also, it's not new, but it's going to become widely advanced in the post-Civil War era. That's the use of what on rifles? Scopes. The use of scopes. Scopes have been around for a while, but now scopes have the technology of scope technology is dramatically improved as a result of the Civil War. Bottom center, that's a Sioux hunting party, and bottom right is an image of the Buffalo Soldiers out on the frontier. All right. So, key legislation and big business in the West. Toward the end of the Western Indian Wars, the government is going to pass a really interesting set of laws. They're called the Dawes Severalty Law. The Dawes Severalty Act, or Dawes Severalty Acts. What the Dawes Severalty Act basically does is it provides Native Americans with the opportunity to assimilate. No longer will the government provide land grants or even try to adopt treaties with tribes. They're going to now negotiate individually with Native people. The result of this is that the natives lose about another estimated 100 to 120 million acres of land as a result of the Doll Severalty Act. Also, this gives Native Americans, if they take the bait and they take the bribe for the land grant, they have the promise of becoming citizens after 25 years. However, those voting rights and those civil rights, they won't really be achieved for Native Americans until 1964, 1965, and 1968. And Native Americans to this day are still fighting for equal rights. Another really messed up thing that came out of the Dawes Acts were the Carlisle Indian schools. This is where the government took children from their families, put them in boarding schools, and totally erased their language, culture, and way of life. Their motto, kill the Indian, save the child. Horrible abuses in these schools. The most famous graduate of the Carlisle School, has anyone ever heard of Jim Thorpe before? He's one of the most famous American athletes. He was a professional football player, professional baseball player, professional basketball player, won 2 Olympic golds, and is considered one of the greatest lacrosse players that ever lived. By the end of his life, he will reject the Carlisle School's mission and encourage Native people to embrace their culture. Mining for gold and silver was big business in the West. Bless you. That's what leads to a lot of people moving out west. Often we just think about the California gold rush of 1848, 49, and 50, but there are huge gold and silver rushes in the post-war era. This will lead very rapidly to the ratification of new states in the post-Civil War era, and remarkably, many of these states will grant women the right to vote upon ratification. Examples, Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1866, Utah gave women the right to vote in 1870, Colorado in 1893, Idaho in 1896. Nearly every Western state that was ratified in the continental U.S. gave women the right to vote prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. For example, Jeanette Rankin from Montana, she's our first woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and Congress. Guys, she's elected in 1916. This is 4 years before the passage of the 19th Amendment. The life of the miner was captured in Mark Twain's book, Roughing It, because he was a prospector for a time. Mining minerals like gold, silver, and iron was not the only big business in the West. Beef was also big business. Stockyards, places like Kansas City, Chicago, led to the rise of the beef barons like Armour and Swift. The invention of the refrigerator car also allowed you to move both produce and meat to market without it spoiling. The cowboy era, which is an era that we have, a deep connection to in this country, was pretty short. It was only about 20 or 30 years that people were moving cattle over the open range. It was also one of the most equal opportunity jobs. Like, it didn't matter if you were a man, a woman, white, African American, Latino. If you were good at wrangling cattle and moving them to market, you kept your job, and if you were bad at it, you lost it. That's why we often tie the theory of rugged individualism to the era of the American cowboy. What brought the era of the cowboy to a conclusion was Joseph Glidden's invention of barbed wire. That takes us from open range to what large-scale style of farming in the West? Ranching. Very good. Nice job. Also, the railroads are going to increase the demand for ranching. The Homestead Act, this allows for more people to go settle out west, especially in the Great Plains. Civil War vets, African Americans, immigrants, you name it, they could buy land cheap, $1.25 per acre, up to 160 acres of land. All you had to do was put $10 down. However, what groups are horribly impacted? Thank you. Native Americans. Excellent. It's very sad. The Transcontinental Railroad will successfully be completed. The first one on May 10th, 1869. This will be the nailing of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah. As we already know, this also led to large waves of Chinese immigration to the west. But by 1900, 5 transcontinental rail lines are finished, and that's when the Chinese exclusion starts. Yellowstone, this is our first step toward conservation under Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. We'll talk more about national parks in lesson 12. Anybody shopped Amazon in the last week? 2 weeks? 1, 2? I do not believe that only 2 people have used Amazon in the last 2 weeks. Come on. 2 people? What? Okay. 3? All right, it's impressive. Last class, like half the classes, hands went up. This is the Amazon of the late 1800s. Sears and Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. This is mail order products. What I mean by this, you could buy a gun, you could buy a dress, you could buy a house, and it would be delivered to you. You'd have to put it together. So, yeah. So on the left here, we have Jim Thorpe, top center, Jeanette Rankin. This is what Deadwood, South Dakota looked like when it was a wild mining and cow town. Top right, Joseph Glidden's patent for barbed wire. Bottom left, an Armour refrigerator car. Bottom center, this is a advertisement for the Homestead Act. And the bottom right here, this is the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Point, Utah. I'm sorry I'm going over just a little bit today. I feel like I've got to, this is like where I need to stop, is with the railroads. Is that cool with you guys? I need to stop with the railroad, and then we'll get into the Second Industrial Revolution next class. Gilded Age and the railroad boom, this is insane. At the end of the Civil War, there's like 35,000 miles of railroad track. By 1900, it increased to just under 200,000 miles. That is a significant amount of growth. From Lincoln all the way to Chester A. Arthur, there had been large grants, land grants, by the federal government to railroad companies. Remember, Grover Cleveland put a stop to the federal land grants. He also established the Interstate Commerce Commission to try to regulate the railroads, but it didn't really work out. The railroads were way too powerful by then. The president that really takes on the railroads and challenges the railroad trust is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. If you were a town where a railroad made it and didn't fail, you were in great shape. If the railroad didn't reach your town, or it bypassed your town, or the railroad failed and connected to your town, you would likely have to pick up and move because now you lived in a ghost town. Anybody ever been to a ghost town in the West? Nice. It's kind of on my bucket list. I want to go to a ghost town. Obviously, Native Americans are horribly impacted because this leads to them being more confined to reservations. It also leads to the death of the buffalo and their way of life. They referred to the railroads as the iron horse. There are a lot of advancements in the railroads. Steel rails, the Westinghouse air brake for safety, the Pullman Palace car, developed by railroad tycoon George Pullman for you to travel in luxury, refrigerator cars to move goods to market, cattle cars, cattle guards, and cattle catchers for the movement of cattle, but also safety so trains didn't get derailed by cattle. Telegraphs ran parallel with rail lines, double tracking to prevent collisions, and block signals to improve safety. A lot of people overinvested in land and in track. Both the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893, lots of railroad company failures in both of those panics. And two guys in particular, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, those were the two guys that were associated with the Black Friday scandal to corner the gold market in 1869. These guys ran two of the most corrupt railroads in American history, the Erie and Wabash Railroads. Jay Gould died of tuberculosis, but Jim Fisk, an angry investor, actually tracked him down and shot and killed him in a hotel. Cornelius Vanderbilt, do y'all remember how he made his money first after the War of 1812? In what industry? Are y'all familiar with Vanderbilt University? You know what their mascot is? Very good. The Commodores. He made his money in shipping. Okay? Then he moved it to railroads. So Vanderbilt University's mascot is Vanderbilt in like a ship captain's hat. His most dominant rail line was the Grand Central that connected New York to Chicago. And he's going to build what cathedral to transportation in New York? Grand Central Station. Has anyone been in there before? It's amazing, isn't it? It's crazy. J.P. Morgan, big time tycoon in finance. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan controls most of the country's railroads, and he controls U.S. Steel Corporation. There's only one man at the turn of the 20th century in America wealthier than J.P. Morgan. Who is it? Rockefeller. Very good. Nice job, guys. A little bit of local flair. We've got our own little tycoons here in Virginia. James H. Dooley. Who's been to Maymont? Hey, there you go. If you haven't been to Maymont, it's a cheap date. You can go over there for free because the Dooleys donated the part to the city. They didn't have kids. Has anybody ever been in the Dooley Mansion before? Cool. If you haven't, you should check it out. If you want to know how rich they were, Mrs. Dooley has a vanity built by Tiffany made of narwhal tusk. That is excessive. Okay? It's still there. Billy Mahone, readjuster fame. He was another Virginia tycoon. And then another famous local tycoon, Collis Pierpont Huntington, established the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. This goes through my little hometown, Clifton Forge, which is now home to the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Heritage Center. My little town of about 3,500 to 4,000 people still has one of the largest train bridges in the world. And at any given time, you can look out, and a lot of those rail cars are full of what? Coming from West Virginia. Coal. Yes. Top left, George Pullman. Center, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Top right, J.P. Morgan. This is a Pullman Palace car on the left, a luxury train car. And on the bottom right, remember, time zones exist scientifically thanks to the prime meridian. But our true standardized time zones in America exist due to the Civil War and the railroad. Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. So everybody was on the same clock. So the trains would run on time. Questions for me? Comments, concerns? All right. That is where I pump the brakes.